The Lantern Keeper, Chapter 1. Welcome home. Welcome back to Embervik. Tonight, I'd like to tell you a quiet story, not a story of great adventures or distant kingdoms, but a story about a single lantern standing beside a quiet fjord where someone has faithfully kept its light alive for longer than anyone can remember. So, make yourself comfortable. Let your breathing become slow and gentle. Allow the worries of today to drift away like mist across calm water. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing you need to solve, nothing waiting for you, except this quiet little place. Far to the north, beyond the busy roads, beyond the crowded towns, there is a narrow fjord surrounded by old mountains. The mornings there arrive slowly. The evenings stay a little longer. And when darkness finally settles across the water, the stars seem close enough to touch. On the eastern shore, where the pine trees meet smooth stones worn by countless winters, stands a small wooden cabin. It isn't large. It never tried to be. Its walls have weathered many storms. Its roof carries the memory of snow from winters long past. And every evening, just before the last blue light disappears beyond the mountains, a single lantern begins to glow beside its old wooden door. No one knows exactly when it first appeared. Some say it has always been there. Others believe someone quietly placed it there many generations ago, and simply never stopped caring for it. Whatever the truth may be, the lantern has never failed to shine. Fishermen have trusted its warm light when fog covered the fjord. Travelers have smiled when they spotted it waiting in the distance after long walks through silent forests. And children, tucked safely beneath warm blankets, have often wondered who lights the lantern. Every single evening, they call him the Lantern Keeper. Yet few people have ever spoken with him, not because he hides, but because he has never believed that quiet things need many words. Chapter 2. The Evening Routine. Every evening, at almost exactly the same time, the Lantern Keeper would step quietly onto the small wooden porch. He never carried a watch. He never needed one. The mountains told him when evening had arrived. The wind carried its own quiet rhythm. And the birds always seemed to know when it was time to return home. The old porch creaked softly beneath his boots. Not loudly, just enough to remind him that another peaceful day had gently passed. The lantern rested where it always had, hanging from a weathered wooden post beside the door. During the day, it waited patiently, cold, quiet, still. But every evening, it came alive. The keeper would carefully open its small glass door. With slow hands, practiced through countless seasons, he trimmed the wick, just a little, never too much. Then, from inside the cabin, he carried a single wooden match. He struck it gently, a tiny spark, followed by a warm golden flame. For just a moment, the little flame danced in the evening air before finding the lantern and quietly settling into its familiar glow. The light was never bright. It didn't need to be. It simply stood there, warm, steady, patient, as though reminding the night that even the smallest light could always find its place among the darkness. The keeper smiled, not because anything remarkable had happened, but because some evenings were already perfect, simply for being ordinary. He stood for another quiet moment, listening. Far across the fjord, gentle waves touched the shoreline. somewhere high in the pine forest. An owl greeted the coming night. The wind carried the fresh scent of evergreen trees, mixed with cool mountain air, and the faint smell of wood smoke drifting from the cabin chimney. Taking one last look at the lantern, the keeper nodded quietly to himself. Another evening had begun. Chapter 3. The cabin by the water. The lantern keeper remained outside just a little longer, watching the warm glow of the lantern settle gently beside the old cabin. The fjord had become almost perfectly still. The mountains stood quietly beneath the evening sky, their dark silhouettes reflected across the water so clearly that it became difficult to tell where the mountains ended and their reflections began. Satisfied, the keeper turned toward the door. It opened with a familiar wooden creak, one he had heard so many times that it had become part of the cabin itself. Warmth greeted him immediately, not the hurried warmth of summer, but the gentle comfort of a fire that had been patiently burning for hours. The scent of pine logs filled the room, mixed with cedar wood, old books, and the faint aroma of tea steeping quietly on the cast-iron stove. Everything inside the cabin seemed to have found its own place many years ago. Nothing felt arranged, nothing felt perfect. Yet somehow, everything belonged exactly where it was. Beside the window stood a worn wooden chair. Its armrests had grown smooth, polished by countless quiet evenings. A thick wool blanket rested neatly across its back. Nearby, an old bookshelf stretched from floor to ceiling. The books carried faded covers, softened by time. Some had been read many times, others, perhaps only once. None of them seemed to mind waiting. The keeper lifted the small kettle from the stove. Steam curled slowly upward, disappearing into the warm air above. He poured the tea into a simple stoneware mug. No patterns, no decoration, just smooth clay, warmed by countless evenings. He wrapped both hands around the cup, allowing the warmth to settle gently into his fingers. Outside, the first stars had begun to appear, tiny points of light scattered across the dark northern sky. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the northern lights would soon begin their quiet dance. But there was no hurry. There never was. The tea would still be warm. The fire would continue to crackle. The lantern would continue to shine. Some things never asked to be rushed. The keeper lowered himself into the old chair. It welcomed him with a soft wooden sigh. He smiled quietly, took one slow sip of tea, and listened as the fire whispered its familiar evening song. Chapter 4. The Keeper's Quiet Ritual. The keeper sat without speaking. He never felt the need to fill a quiet room with words. The fire already had its own language. The wind outside spoke softly through the pine trees. The old cabin answered with the occasional creak of seasoned timber. Together, it was more than enough. He lifted the warm mug once more. This time, he closed his eyes before taking a sip, not because he was tired, but because some moments deserved to be noticed completely. The tea carried the gentle taste of mountain herbs, gathered during the short northern summer, dried carefully and stored in small glass jars upon a wooden shelf. He never measured the leaves. He never followed a recipe. Somehow, each cup always turned out exactly as it should. The fire crackled softly. One log settled deeper into the glowing embers, sending a small shower of golden sparks dancing behind the iron grate. The keeper watched them rise, disappear, and smiled. Even tiny things had their own quiet journeys. Beside his chair stood a small wooden table. Resting upon it was an old journal. Its leather cover had faded with age. The corners had softened from years of careful hands opening and closing its pages. He opened it slowly. Inside, there were no grand stories, no remarkable discoveries, no important dates, only small observations. The first snowfall arrived quietly today. The lantern shone brightly through the evening mist. An owl rested on the old pine again. The tea tasted especially warm tonight. Nothing more, nothing less. He believed life was often remembered best through its smallest moments. Outside, snow began to fall, slowly, patiently, one delicate snowflake at a time. The lantern outside continued to glow, its warm light catching each falling flake before letting it drift gently into the darkness. The keeper looked toward the window, then quietly whispered, almost to himself, "Another peaceful night." Chapter 5. Beneath the northern lights, the snow continued to fall, softly, quietly, until the world outside the cabin seemed wrapped in a gentle blanket of white. The keeper stood once more. He placed the empty mug beside the fire, pulled on his old wool coat, and opened the cabin door. A cool breath of winter air drifted inside, fresh, clean, silent. The lantern welcomed him with its familiar golden glow. It had not changed, it never hurried. It simply waited, exactly where it always had. The keeper stepped carefully onto the snow-covered path. His boots left slow, gentle footprints, leading only a few steps from the porch. Then he stopped. There was no destination, no task waiting to be finished. Sometimes, he simply liked to stand beneath the night sky. Above him, the first ribbons of green light began to appear, faint at first, almost shy. Then, little by little, they stretched quietly across the stars. The northern lights never made a sound. They didn't ask anyone to admire them. They simply danced, because dancing was what they had always done. The keeper watched them with calm eyes. He had seen them hundreds, perhaps thousands of times. Yet somehow, they never became ordinary. Every evening, they seemed to tell the same quiet story. That beauty never needed to hurry. The fjord reflected the colors perfectly. Green, blue, soft silver. For a brief moment, it felt as though the sky had decided to visit the water. The keeper smiled, not because the lights were rare, but because they reminded him that some of life's greatest gifts ask for nothing except a little patience. He closed his eyes, listened. Snowflakes landing softly upon his coat, gentle waves touching the shoreline, the quiet whisper of pine trees beyond the cabin, and somewhere, far across the still water, the faint call of a lone owl greeting the night. The keeper took one slow breath, filled his lungs with the cold northern air, then opened his eyes once more. The lantern still glowed beside the cabin, waiting, just as it always would. Chapter 6. The Light That Remains. The keeper stood quietly beside the lantern, watching its gentle light stretch across the snow. The night had settled completely now. The mountains rested beneath the blanket of stars. The fjord reflected every quiet shimmer above, until sky and water seemed to become one. There was nothing left to do. No unfinished work, no hurried thoughts. The lantern had been lit. The fire was warm. The cabin was waiting. Everything was exactly as it should be. The keeper looked once more toward the path leading into the forest. Fresh snow had already begun to soften his footprints. By morning, they would be gone, and somehow he liked that. The mountains never kept count of footsteps. The wind never remembered yesterday. The fjord never hurried toward tomorrow. Nature simply welcomed each new day, exactly as it arrived, quietly, patiently, without asking anything in return. The keeper gently rested one hand against the wooden post that held the lantern. The wood felt cool beneath his fingertips, familiar, steady, like greeting an old friend. He smiled, not because he expected tomorrow to be perfect, but because tonight was already enough. Above him, the northern lights slowly drifted westward. Their soft colors faded little by little, until only the stars remained. The snow continued to fall, gentle, silent, endless. The keeper stepped back toward the cabin. He closed the wooden door behind him. The fire welcomed him once again. Outside, the lantern continued to glow, waiting beside the quiet fjord, just as it always had. Perhaps someone would pass by tomorrow. Perhaps no one would. It didn't matter. The light would still be there. Because that is what lights like these do. They wait, they welcome, they ask for nothing. And if, somewhere beyond these quiet mountains, you ever find yourself searching for a peaceful place, perhaps without even realizing it, you'll remember a small wooden cabin beside a still northern fjord where a single lantern continues to glow every evening, quietly, patiently, faithfully. And maybe that quiet little light will remind you that no matter how busy the world becomes, there will always be places where nothing asks you to hurry. Thank you for spending this peaceful evening here in Embervik. Wherever your journey takes you next, may you always find a quiet place to rest your mind. And should you ever return, you'll find the lantern still burning.